Hi, this is Roger Green, host of the Surfing the Nash Tsunami podcast. This week, we celebrated 2 Surfing Nash milestones, 20,000 downloads on Buzzsprout, and 1 year on that platform. The episode itself included excerpts of 5 interviews with a total of 7 surfers. This weekend, we are offering these interviews in full. In this conversation, Jörn Schattenberg and Ian Rowe joined Louise, Campbell, and me for separate conversations. Jörn discussed some of his high-visibility podcast moments this year, and we all discussed why his article on why NASH drug trials fail, what he called the NASH drug graveyard, was so popular and well-received. Ian discussed how he formed his approach to health systems research and what it leads him to consider that others might not as much. One thing all 4 have in common, mad respect for how England performed in the Euro 2020. These are longer than your typical weekend conversations, but between the energy, insight, and crazy laughter, the time should just slip by. So, sit back, listen, enjoy, learn, and when you're done, join the discussion on our LinkedIn and Facebook discussion groups. Right now, Louise and I are fortunate to be joined by Jörn Schattenberg, who's, we were just agreeing, is hardly a guest of the podcast at this point, virtually a semi-regular. How are you today?
Thanks, Roger. I'm fine.
So, Jörn, first of all, thanks for everything you've done to support us over the past year. You've been with us, I guess, 8 or 9 times at this point. I believe you are the single most frequent person who's never been a regular in terms of podcast appearances. So thank you for that and welcome. So what I'm trying to remember is how you first engaged or how we engaged with you in the first place anyway. I think I know when. I'm not sure I remember how. Go ahead.
Thanks, Roger. And it's really a great honor to be here and be talking to you. And I enjoy the podcast tremendously. I think I came across it in the first place when I was looking for some information related to the complete response letter that was, I guess, was published about a year ago in regards to the phase 3 uricolic acid study. And I found something where Stephen Harrison commented with some other folks on what he thought was going on there and how that could shape the field. And when I realized it was an entire podcast episode, I went back and listened to that while I was on my evening runs. And it was that time, it's about the right length to take it on a run. And I think that's when I started to follow the podcast.
So that's a longer run than my typical evening run. So I'm thinking, how long did you run that evening?
You normally go for an hour. So if you have a lot of guests and a lot of comments, I have to run longer.
Because I think this was a longer event. Yeah, my runs are normally about 40, 45 minutes. I go an hour once in a while, but not commonly. So that's interesting because that brought us to several people's attention, I think. And then in the aftermath, before we reached out to you about joining us for the easel coverage last year, which was, I believe, the first time you were with us, had you reached out to Stephen? Because we're going over who to bring to easel, and Stephen, and we wanted folks from Europe who had interesting points of view, and you were one of the first 2 people Stephen mentioned, and he then described you as the nicest guy in hepatology. So therefore, we figured you'd say yes. But had you reached out to Stephen after that episode, or was the next thing when we said, hey, come join us?
I forgot. And see, one thing the podcast has been for me is a platform to exchange and share ideas and discuss with peers. But there hasn't been an opportunity to do so during conferences. So I think for me, this has really been a tremendous experience with you hosting so many interesting people, being able to engage in those discussions. And that from my side, being able to say what I think and hear what others think is the biggest advantage of this podcast.
Louise, you have a question or two before I can keep going, but because I'm a researcher, but if you have questions, this would be a good point to interject.
Mine's just an overall comment. I think what Jörn has always brought to the podcast has always been that dynamic view of moving it into more of a public arena, along with your latest publication. Again, placing emphasis now on moving it from healthcare and that transitioning, which is obviously akin to some of the where I'm moved from healthcare to. And so that is such a heartwarming and sort of innovative place to be going with liver disease. And the more you produce, and we discussed before Christmas about German magazines covering fatty liver disease, Christmas being the time, and this awareness is increasing, and I think it's a nice place to be. So you've always brought that exciting dynamic, apart from the academic, pure science side. That integration always excites me, that when you come on and we get to discuss your work, so it was fantastic.
So Louise, I'm laughing because one of the questions I was going to ask you while we had Jörn with us was, what was your favorite Jörn Schattenberg moment of the past year, except that I knew that the answer was going to be talking about the German media right before Christmas. So you actually beat me to the punch.
You know me so well after all this months.
We've been hanging out a bunch, haven't we? So, Jörn, what's your favorite moment of the on the podcast over the past year?
I was trying to think. I wouldn't single out a single moment. I love the ones you bring in new people because, of course, of your inquiries about the special moments. So when I learned that my respected colleague and good friend Mazen Noureddin was a great basketball player, I enjoyed that. You know, I like to see the personal sides. That's really your strength in pulling people together and getting them to discuss disclose something to a broader public here that hasn't been known? Those are the highlights.
Well, I'm still trying to get Alina Allen and Naeem Al-Khoury to record a record together, since neither one of them knew about the other. Jörn, by the way, I also know Donna Cryer's favorite Jörn Schattenberg moment, because she talked about it last week when she was hosting the podcast, which was the realization that you came to that you were having a hard time communicating to some of your Turkish patients about NASH because you only had German language literature. I think that might be actually Donna's favorite moment of all the podcasts so far, even surpassing Louise's favorite Donna moment, which is when she explained to Vlad Ratziu that once you're dead, you're dead. It doesn't matter what you die of. You were around for that one also, I believe.
And I still have that in the aftermath. Donna sent me, I think it was Arabic information sheet, and I used that 5 or 6 times since then. So I really think this is how the podcast connects and brings people together.
Thank you. We're amazingly fortunate in that regard. We're doing this at a point in time when the world has shrunk. And because of the podcast, because of the pandemic, no one could leave their homes. So engaging was easier, and engaging on multiple levels, I think, was easier. The work that Donna has done on these kinds of issues is fantastic. So, Jörn, let me tell you my favorite Jörn Schattenberg moment. It's not a moment. It's actually a data point. We've put out at this point, I think the number is 87 or 88 pieces of original content. And of those 80-something, of the top 10 most listened to, 6 of them had to do with conferences. The 7th was the FDA webcast last January 30th. One of them was the launch of Liver Healthy by EchoSense and their partners. And then the other 2 were people talking about papers of real interest, one being Matt Kelly from Perspectum coming on and talking about the first cover scan work. And the other was your paper on why drug trials fail. And it's actually, of every published piece of research that we've talked about in this podcast, the one that's gotten the most listens and the most responses, which I find, A, fitting, because I say you're our most frequent guest who's never been a full-timer. But second, it was a great piece of work, and I think it hit people right in the wheelhouse at the moment it came about. We may have talked about this on the podcast at the time. How did you come to decide to do that paper, and how did you pull it together?
The paper was actually an initiative. A colleague of mine from Holland has invited me or reached out because he said, you're close to all these trials, and me not following so closely the field, I'm just realizing there's been a couple of failures. So why do you think that is? And then we discussed them back and forth and said, well, this is a whole academic discussion by itself. So let's put it to paper. And we're fortunate enough to have it published. On the first version, does it still say graveyard? I think we had the NASH graveyard on it. I'm not sure it made it into the title because there was some going back and forth whether we should use that word. For sure, NASH is not the graveyard. So I'd like to highlight that it really excelled the field, and it highlights to us where to go and where to move with the next studies. And I think the trials we're seeing now have really emerged from the experience we had over the last years.
First of all, I agree with that. I believe the word graveyard was still in it at the time that we ran the podcast, which means maybe the word graveyard stayed. Listen, I thought it was not an inappropriate choice of words, not because NASH was a graveyard. NASH isn't. I think we're in the process of demonstrating that, but because you were basically doing an autopsy on trials that were dead. So things that die go to graveyards. Therefore, I thought it was actually a graphic, but not at all inappropriate. What have you seen that's emerged from that paper in terms of people asking different questions or asking you different questions or designing differently?
I think the most important aspect is on how to design your phase 3 trial based on your phase 2 population. And we've discussed this a couple of times on the podcast. You should not move to a phase 3 if you're not truly explored that population in your phase 2 study, or you should add in another phase 2 before moving to phase 3. I think this was, bottom line, one of the big reasons why some of those trials we were looking at failed.
So I think that covers that paper. The other thing I've been struck by is some of our most highly rated conference podcasts have been the ones that have had you and Vlad together. And I don't know that Vlad is going to make it for the 20K celebration, hasn't responded yet. But Louise, what do you think it is about the dynamic between those two folks that attracts so much attention or listenership?
When I listen, when both of them are around, they come from slightly different aspects. And therefore, it's like tennis. You have a great conversation and somebody will put a topspin on something and the next person will use a lob. So the actual debate between both Jörn and Vlad is always interesting. Even with a common agreement, somebody will put something different into the mix that actually is thought-provoking and may take you in a different direction. And going back to NASH trials, one of the reasons that the piece was so well listened to is the fact that you can take so much from what you offer, Jörn, in your analysis and use it to frame your future trials. and learn from it without having to deep dive sometimes. The comments that were made, and both of you and Vlad do that, so people can take that away, use it practically to help design, review, aka your phase 2 to phase 3, and actually implement it for patient care and development in real time and look at it. And I think that's what they both bring to the dynamic when they're on. That's invaluable. Stephen brings a different dynamic. Everybody brings something, but I don't think you can go away from listening to one of the podcasts and not have learned something that can make you think in a different direction. So that's my personal feeling of what both of them bring, and I could think of a couple of comedy duos that they can match, but certainly from that aspect.
I want to run with your metaphor for a minute. Jörn, do you play tennis?
I used to. I'm not a great tennis player these days anymore.
When I thought I was good, I wasn't very good. So I get that point. I'm going to let Louise start her metaphor then. So Louise, in the tennis match between Jörn and Vlad, who sits on the baseline and hits wicked two-handers with topspin, and who serves and volleys?
Well, I'm a great fan of Steffi Graf, having seen her play an awful lot, and nobody cared to hit a line like Steffi Graf. So I'm actually going to say that Jörn is the baseline player. I can nail those lines. Vlad would be the opposite. He'll be the one that will put the lob in to consider it, and from that side. So, like any great German tennis player, nail the lines.
For whatever reason, I had the same vision. I saw you hitting two-handers from both sides on the baseline and just top spinning the stuffing out of the ball, and Vlad serving at 150 or 160 and following, and the serve is in. He does great when the serve is in, and he has to take a second serve. But I think that's interesting.
It's interesting you mentioned that. I love the discussions with him, and he's such a knowledgeable person in the field, has seen so many things, and his analysis is always such a sharp to the point. And then it's easy for me to return some of my thoughts to him. So I think I enjoy him, and let's have another session with him.
We'll try to make that happen. Jörn, what would you like to see us do on this podcast next year that we've not done so far?
That's a good question, Roger. I'd clearly like to see the podcast be carried forward. I mentioned it being a substitute for personal contact during conferences, but I think it's taken over and it's fulfilled its own spot here in the NASH arena, where exchange of ideas and constant thinking about new ways to present data is very important. So clearly, I think with a weekly format, you're right there able to discuss what's happening. We see so much output. There's so many great guests on your podcast. I'd like to encourage you and your entire team. And again, congratulations to what you've been achieved. I mean, this is a celebration for you and the HepDynamics team here, because it's highly rated and it's highly listened to, and because you've done it right. And I think I'd like to see this carry on. This is not going to end with COVID, which is hopefully going to end at one point. And I think we'll just have to discuss the data, the emerging thoughts, and hopefully at one point how to implement therapies into clinical care.
So first of all, no, I don't see any likelihood that we're going to be stopping the podcast in the near future for the reasons you say. And also, frankly, because I think NASH and NAFLD are in a funny place right now. People anticipate usually the drugs and diagnostics will develop on a common schedule. Here, the diagnostics have gotten ahead of the drugs. And because of the pandemic, some of the trials are slower than they were. So that there isn't quite as rapid a flow of drug data as you might have anticipated if you were mapping out the world pre-pandemic. But a lot of great diagnostics, a lot of great modeling, and a lot of great learning really about not just the therapeutics, but everything else. So if anything, I envision us having a different set of choices to make, because we're going to have a broader set of topics to choose from, which I think is really going to be fun.
I agree, and I'd be happy to come back on as a guest.
Well, we expect you to, actually. One of the things I'll drop you a note on next week is, as we start planning our next 3 or 4 months, what are a couple of things you'd like to come on and highlight, either papers of yours or other work or other topics that you think are particularly important to the audience. Jörn will be with us next week when we're bringing Jeff Lazarus to talk about his paper on the comprehensive care models for NAFLD and comparative care models for NAFLD, something I'm really excited about. Jörn, what else do you see coming up in the next 3 or 4 months that will be important topics to cover?
So to be very precise, of course, we're going to see AASLD in November. Until then, there's been some decisions by compounds being stopped. There's been an ASK1 inhibitor that's being trialed in a phase 2 that's going to be discontinued, is my understanding. There's not going to be a big data output, I believe, but we'll have new trials starting, and the landscape is going to be more competitive. And one of the aspects we could discuss is, of course, and I always wondered, is how do investigators decide, if I have 2 competing trials, which patient do I put into which trial, and how does that affect the trial? There's a lot of enrollment activities going on, and this could also be something we'll be able to discuss in the next month.
That's a fascinating subject, and I think what goes along with this is this entire idea of pooling trials, so that a set of multiple trials are recruiting patients together, and And then your question of how are patients allocated, I think really becomes even more fascinating if you've got two or more companies that are collaborating. Something else, apropos of your comment about Ask One, and I'm just throwing this idea out. What do we learn when mechanisms fail, or when the first trial with a given mechanism fails? What are the lessons there? When do we decide that the mechanism just isn't worth the effort, or Stephen would say the juice isn't worth the squeeze, or the climb isn't worth the view, or whichever one of those metaphors you want to pick, versus when do we decide that what we've learned is how to do it better, not how to stop doing it?
Yeah, that's exactly the point. And it might even be more complex, or it might not fit the strategy of the company. Remember the Alder Furman discussion we had here? You got to look at each trial separately. Some have transitioned between companies, and this could be a barrier. And then the question is this the right population? Maybe there are signs with regards to efficacy or safety and interim analyses. I think you got to go one by one and decide what's the real. You can learn from every single one of them. We'll come back to the NASH therapeutics graveyard, trying to decipher what brings us forward by looking at things that have stopped.
We're then going to map the graveyard into sections, based on exactly why it is the trial died. I like it. I think it's promising. Louise, what else would you like to ask Jörn today?
No, I think he's answered the questions really well, and I'm excited to obviously do the paper with Jeff Lazarus and have that discussion, because it was such a great paper and everything coming forward. Absolutely. Hot topics. Anything that fails is a disappointment, but looking at the reasons intrinsic to that, vital to be able to develop the next. And we will develop the next.
Because this is the first time I am on with Louise after the completion of the European Cup. The English team didn't fail. They just postponed their success. I think it was a great team and a great tournament, Louise. And I hope to see them back in the World Championship right on top there.
From a personal note, it was disappointing in the end, but actually I think the tactics were wrong. You've got the fastest wingers and things like that, and we put them on 2 minutes before the end, but it's a shame. But football will come home Sunday, and that is such a parody on what a humour take out of ourselves. It's hysterical, but it's great fun. But as a result of that, my husband did get COVID, but hey.
Actually, tell Jörn the story. It's a great story.
We were, after I saw you, well, obviously, we went to the semi-final. And when England scored, everybody jumped up and down. People fell down rows. It was hysterical because there were 60,000 people in the crowd. This guy's phone fell into my bag on my jacket. My husband picked the jacket up, gave it to this young guy, and this young guy kissed him, and it's like, forget social distancing. So we've just been isolating because he's just had COVID, but we removed his liver fat over the last few months, and he just got a cold, and he is double vaccinated, but oh my God.
Glad to hear that as well.
It has been funny, but forced isolation has been the result. But he looked so sad when we lost it. That's all I can say. Having just been diagnosed with COVID and then to lose, he was very sad.
That's a bad day, isn't it?
That wasn't a very good day because he only got found out because he was due to fly to Europe. So his PCR test came back positive. So it was a triple whammy. We lost, he got COVID, and he couldn't fly.
No good news in that one. All right.
So, yeah. Thanks for the congratulations we got there, Jörn. It came at a cost.
And Jörn, thanks for joining us, and thanks for your congratulations. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Roger. Looking forward to talk to you again.
Have a great weekend.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
So Louise and I are here with our good friend Ian Rowe. Ian, happy Friday. How are you today?
I'm very good, thank you. Looking forward to a few days off.
Do you have a lot just the weekend, or do you have things going on next week as well?
I've got a couple of days off at the beginning of next week because it's school holidays and my children will need looking after, so somebody's got to do it.
So will this be a staycation that is a different kind of labor, or are you actually taking them somewhere?
No, this will be hard work at home for me and fun for them, I hope. They were away in Northumberland last week, and I've got a poster for a sandcastle competition on the northeast coast that I need to send to Stephen.
Fantastic. I'm sure he'll be delighted to get it. It'll give me an excuse to go back to the Riviera, the redneck Riviera, as it will, but as it were. But great. So thanks for joining us. As you know, we're celebrating our 20,000th download with Buzzsprout, and also our 1 year of being with Buzzsprout. But I think the 20,000 downloads is a more important number. And just trying to visit back with some of our favorite co-surfers, as it were. You being one of them. What do you recall about how we all connected up in the first place?
Well, so I saw the launch of the podcast, I think, on Twitter somewhere. And it sort of piqued my interest. I thought, I wonder what that's all about. And I listened to the first couple of episodes, and I thought there might be other ways of looking at the problem. And I think that there are many ways in which we might address, how we prevent progressive liver disease in people who've got fatty liver. So Kai then reached out to you using LinkedIn on one of the notice boards, and we linked up that way. So
that was actually the second thing that happened. I can tell you what the first one was. I don't know. I think I mentioned it to you at the time. Louise, you may recall this. It was right after the OCA CRL and out on Twitter. And some guy I've never heard of in Leeds posted a note saying, can't wait to see what the hep die people think of this. And then that was you. And then we started doing a little research. And then it turned out you had reached out to us. And I said, oh, gosh, what a coincidence. How delightful. But anybody who takes it of himself to at that point in time, we didn't have a lot of people talking about us out there. But anybody at that point in time who was reputable and was willing to, of his own volition, talk about how interesting we were, I figured, there's a social science data point that says that men decide how intelligent women are after their first date by how much they let the man talk. So by that standard, if you were smart enough to put us up on Twitter, obviously you were a smart guy, and it turns out you are, and it's worked out really well from there.
And he gave you the title of reputable, so that's really impressive.
Yeah. I guess that just showed that that I'd been listening, but also that there was definitely a need for the community at large to hear some of the thoughts about the big things that were happening. And the CRL was probably the biggest thing that happened other than COVID during the first part of 2020, at least, and trying to understand a bit about the background or what the perceived background was to that decision making, I thought would be really interesting. And the episode that followed that was an excellent discussion about the issues that were raised. And I think because I'd seen value in what I was hearing, I thought it was worth other people perhaps hearing that too.
So thank you for that. And I have to also confess that I'm a big fan of counterintuitivity by nature. And some of the things that you've brought to the podcast are a different perspective. You look at different data and you look at it from a different angle. And in some places, I think that's been extraordinarily helpful. Most notably on the question of people who die with NAFLD, what do they actually succumb to? And the paper from, was it Easel that suggested, or was it that suggested that in fact the leading cause of death was liver disease, and the cardiovascular is highly overrated, and then the subsequent different way you looked at that data was one of my 5 or 6 favorite things we've done on the entire podcast, frankly, in all 80 and 90 episodes. So I thank you for many things, and one of which is that one.
Grateful to be of service in that case. I think it's important that we remember the whole patient. And one of the themes that I think has gradually built during the last 18 months of the podcast is that wider recognition of the metabolic phenotype and the importance of trying to address the whole of the patient, not just the liver disease specifically.
Point well taken. So, Louise, what would you like to check in with Ian on before we move into the next part of this conversation?
I absolutely, totally agree with Ian on that. And I think that's what he was bringing to the podcast. And I think we had a conversation, Ian, with Donna Cryer as part of this earlier. And we were looking at the different ways that people look at their behaviour, whether it's from a wellness aspect or from a medical aspect, and looking at why we as medical nursing and physicians take it a more parental role. And the argument being it's about the evidence. And you've highlighted lots of evidence, but as Donna said, the evidence is designed and been formulated by scientists who are asking their own questions. None of these are driven, the questions that we answer aren't driven by the patients. They're driven by our own scientific investigation. And she would put forward, therefore, that they need to be driving the research questions and we need to be answering their specific questions. And I think you certainly bring that holistic approach in some of the evidence that you've done, particularly with the ELF test in relation to liver function tests and screening, and whether or not it was relevant or not when you actually got through and just ditch it and do FibroScan in the first place. But I think that holistic side needs to be given, but we also need to look at the data from different aspects within it. And that's what you bring. You challenge sometimes what the data is. They suggest the data showing with that counterintuitive and opposite approach, which is great. I love it. For me, that's what the podcast's about. It's about challenging our own stereotypes, bringing in something else that may be a missing link in that puzzle and pie, because the phenotypes are just so varied. So that's what I've really enjoyed.
While you're formulating or thinking about what to say, and let me pile on top of Louise's comment, I think the way that you collect data and the work that you're doing in Leeds is really uniquely helpful, at least in the context of what we've put up on the podcast. I think, when you look at things like we're going to be talking next week about Jeff Lazarus's article on different models for NAFLD care. And I think that and what you do share a point I'm going to get to in a second. But was it with Donna? We were talking about the idea, it's exactly what you were saying, Louise, that when people do clinical trials, they're doing it either to prove a point that they care about or to help an investor get a drug to market. And there is a reality that those of us who've worked in marketing and research know, which is that if you want to talk about developing drugs, talk to KOLs. But if you want to talk about how real patients are being treated on the ground, don't. And when you don't have drugs in the marketplace yet, it's hard to get together a data set that's about the realistic treatment of patients. And yes, you certainly are an academic and a professor and all that stuff, but the data that you're working with is community data. And as a result, I think a real reality check on care. A good friend of mine says strategy is what happens. What you're looking at is what happens. And I think the viewpoint that it gives us is really helpful. How did you come to start looking at things that way, or to decide that that was what you wanted to do?
So that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I went to medical school I started medical school 25 years ago this year, and I walked into a lecture theatre expecting to be fed information from the first day, only to find, to my surprise, that they completely changed the curriculum to one that was very student-led and problem-solving in its nature. And I was sort of trained in that way, and a lot of it was about understanding problems for yourself. And I think the way that I went about solving those problems has stood me in good stead for my whole career, in particular, a sort of clinical research career where you're faced with problems every day. And it's about trying to understand the totality of the evidence. And you can become very focused on, and this is a sort of an academic's prerogative, really, to become very focused on the detail of a small problem. And I think it pays dividends to focus more widely, to look at the breadth of the issues, and to decide how, having weighed that evidence, how you think you should look at the problem. And it's not always, and often isn't, the same way that everybody else is looking at it. And I think a fresh perspective is always valuable from whichever side that it comes.
Can you define what it is about your perspective when you look at how you look at things versus other people? What feels different about it to you?
So I think that I take a much more public health focused approach in terms of thinking about not only the impact of what we do for our patients, but the impact of that on the system. So whether that's about when the right time is to make a diagnosis, what the impact of that would be on the patient, what it would change for the patient and how it might impact them. But also, particularly in the UK, where costs are much more restrained, it gives you you have to remember the whole system and the opportunity cost of the pound that I spend looking for a patient who's got fatty liver disease. That's a pound that's not spent on another patient. And almost inevitably, displacing costs in the NHS displaces treatment that we know already work. We have to be absolutely sure that what we're doing is both right for the individual patient, but right for society too.
I get that. That makes complete sense to me. That said, some of the way you've influenced my thinking personally more than anything else, and there are several, is to take a systems perspective, but not the one you just described, but to view whatever you're looking at as a process, to go one step at a time and to ask what makes sense. So one of the real contributions that to me that's come out of your work, and it's the ELF thing that Louise mentioned, is theoretically it might be right to go from FIB4 to ELF to FibroScan, quote unquote, only if you need to. But if the reality is that every time ELF doesn't confirm what you believe, you're going to go to FibroScan whether you should or not, then the question is why do ELF, which is fundamentally, if I understand it, the challenge that you raised. And that's not a question of what's logical. That's not a question of what is hypothetically cost effective. That's simply a question of factoring human nature and how humans make decisions into a algorithm, which is a very, I think, important kind of systems approach. And I actually look at everything I see in this space differently because you taught me that lesson.
One of the other things that I'm involved in is about understanding allocation of liver transplants in the UK. And we've done a lot of work trying to optimize that system. We've got a much, much more complex system than there is in the US that's run by UNOS. And our system incorporates a massive number of parameters. But the thing that we've never been able to measure is the surgical decision-making on the day that a liver is offered to the patient through the surgeon. And trying to understand how behavior changes systems is a big challenge. And I think it's one that will, as we become more sophisticated in our approach to patients who've got fatty liver, both in terms of diagnostics, but also as treatments come online, that sort of decision-making is going to become more and more important.
To save that thought, we might want to come back to it in a minute. I want to go on to the next formal question, which is, of everything you've heard or been involved with this podcast in the past year, what's the one thing you liked best or thought was most important, or both?
I'm going to go back to Donna. And I was listening to the Easel wrap-up episode with Donna and Vlad Ratsiu when they were talking about... Louise is laughing because she knows what I'm going to say, but they were talking
I'm laughing because this is my best episode ever every time, because I can see Donna's face, and you've just referenced Donna's face, and we discussed that with Donna the other day. It has to be my funniest moment for a long time.
This is why Louise is laughing. This comes up over and over again in different contexts. But yes, go ahead.
But it's so important because Vlad was very clear that he was a hepatologist focused on treating patients' liver disease. Donna said, it doesn't matter why I'm dead, I'm dead. And that patient perspective is fundamental, particularly in a disease where the fatty liver is part of a much wider phenotype, and where in the vast majority of cases, people who've got fatty liver will not die of their liver disease. And we have to be sure that when we're making the diagnosis, we're going to have a positive impact on the patient. And, like moments in time, but I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing when I was listening to that, sitting at my kitchen table, hoping that the children had gone to sleep upstairs as I caught up on the last 20 minutes of the podcast that evening. And it was remarkable because it really clicked, and it highlights the mindset of hepatology in general. This is a liver disease, I must treat the liver disease. But it shows what's really important to the patients, and that is, what we do has to have a benefit to them.
Following on from that, and just referring to what you said earlier, for every pound that you spend looking for liver disease, it's a pound that you're not spending on another disease. The counter argument to that is for every pound you spend looking for liver disease, you will find your high-risk diabetics of developing type 2 diabetes, of cardiac disease. For that pound could come back in so many other ways as a preventative cost. So that pound is well invested in my book.
So it's interesting you should say that, because I don't think I'm getting as much purchase from some of the academic KOLs as I would hope on your point. I think there's a strong argument to be made. But obviously, and Mazen has shown the cost effectiveness numbers on this, on the value of testing every T2D, right? But part of my belief about that is that we could actually educate endocrinologists how to treat their diabetic patients better if they knew which ones had fatty liver and which ones had NAFLD versus NASH versus no liver involvement. That you can actually treat the diabetes with a more holistic point of view of what you're trying to achieve if you know the answer to that question. And if you understand a little bit about the mechanism by which a patient with NAFLD, that insulin sensitization has a lot to do with why NAFLD would become NASH or not. And some of the cardiovascular issue, don't worry about the hepatologist for a minute. Right now, the endo thinks that she or he is treating the overall patient. But I know in the state, I've been told in the States by someone I believe, that if you take a look at the testing that endocrinologists order up a whole bunch of liver enzymes, which I think they probably call liver function tests, but they don't order up a bunch of NASH tests, not a lot of FIB4 or any of that stuff. And I just can't help but believe, and this is from the Ian Rowe school, how do you look at things, that or the school that you brought, certainly Louise's as well, that if we were to take a look at the effect of doing those tests on those patients in terms of what happened to their cardiovascular rates, and frankly, just how much cardiovascular treatment they got and whether it affected the diabetes drugs they were on, you'd probably find that if people knew what they were doing and did that at the right time, you could meaningfully change care tomorrow.
I think there's probably some truth to that. And it takes us into this, what I think is quite a difficult space about understanding what the indication for a treatment in a patient who's got NASH is going to be, and how much of that relates to liver disease and how much it relates to the metabolic multimorbidity. And I guess as time goes on, we'll begin to understand that a bit more as the treatments that we get to see in the clinic have more and more pluripotent effects, not only treating the liver disease, but also having significant benefits on the cardiometabolic phenotypes.
Question. The historic payer perspective in the U.S. at least has been, I've got great diabetes drugs, I've got great statins, I've got great cardiovascular drugs. All I really want to know is what you do for the liver. I've got more efficient ways to manage pleiotropic effects or the potent issues. The second school of thought goes, if I can do this with fewer drugs, better. And if the drugs I use have pleiotropic effects, it probably means this is a more holistic solution than simply shooting at numbers. A, which do you believe is more likely to be correct? And B, how do you think treatment is likely to evolve given that human behavior and human systems don't always do the right thing?
So I don't know the answer to your first question, which is correct. The former is much more likely because the drugs that people are using at the moment have meaningful clinical outcomes associated with them, particularly. So if you take the GLP-1s or SGLT2s for management of diabetes, then the evidence tells us that they will reduce cardiovascular risk, and the SGLT2s then they'll reduce the risk of nephropathy, and in the appropriate context will improve heart failure. So I think for drugs that target liver disease to be prescribed for their other benefits, then we're going to have to see clear evidence of outcome benefits associated with those additional effects. Well, and inevitably that's going to take time, and it's probably going to take significant investment from somebody to do those studies. And I think that's one of the big open questions about whether those studies will be done. And I don't know the answer to that. I think it would be a disservice to our patients if they weren't done, if we've got a drug that is good for liver disease and looks like it'll be good for other things too. But that'll be up to the companies and the market and all of those other factors.
Go ahead, Louise. I see you nodding and smiling at once. That's usually a cue.
Well, I think that brings us back to the argument at the beginning. Roger and I both commented following Donna Cryer that the research is driven by the drug company to answer the specific question that they want rather than the patient need, and the patient driving the question that we should, as professionals in any form of healthcare, we should be answering the questions that are the most pertinent questions to the patient. And I think you've just highlighted an extremely valuable area where actually highlighting what would be the best opportunity for the patient or the person with the condition, because a lot of these people have never been diagnosed yet and may not be diagnosed until late. I agreed with you that I thought it was going to be the former, because I think the former is one that we currently probably use most, and we are seeing an exponential rise in end-stage liver disease being presented late, liver cancer. So it would support that it's not necessarily helping liver disease within those populations.
Yeah, and I think, frankly, going back to what's practical in physician care, that's probably true as well. I did a lot of work back, say, 10, 15 years ago on, and more recently, actually, because I did some work on the PCSK9s and on glycerin. But you would ask doctors about treating cholesterol, and they would say, well, gee, I treat the total patient. And you'd listen to what that meant, and then you'd say, how do you decide which total patient needs treating? And they'd tell you it was their LDL levels. In fact, it almost didn't matter what the precursor conversation was. The answer in the end was always LDL levels. So I can tell myself whatever I want, but if I wind up in the same place, then I'm looking at the same thing. Going back to, you can do an ELF, but you're going to wind up on FibroScan anyway, so I do the ELF, right? Similar kind of phenomenon. So Ian, what would you like to see us do more of or differently, or would you like to engage in with us over the next year?
So one of the things that I sort of not miss, but I think might be quite good would be to try and get a bit more debate. There are good conversations, but some of the views are quite similar. So there's often quite a lot of sort of collegiality and, oh, yes, I think that too. And the field is uncertain still. We still don't know what the best way to do lots of the things that we need to do. The evidence is shifting in a good way. It's being consolidated and it's gradually drifting down. But on the EASL episode or the wrap-up session when we were talking about non-invasive testing, we were sort of getting to a point where we might actually be able to say, well, I think we should just stick to one non-invasive test now. No, I think we've got enough evidence for whichever one that it is. But there wouldn't, inevitably there would be a range of views expressed around that. And I think discussions like that would actually be quite valuable to try and encourage people off the fence, to try and, it's a difficult forum in which to do that, but I think people off the fence and really expressing their views and opinions would be really good if it was possible to do that.
So we're going to have to find all the bold people.
Yes.
In fact, we were just talking with Jörn and about the episodes that are Jörn and Vlad, which Louise likened to being a tennis match because they've got different styles of play and you wind up in those conversations.
Yeah.
I actually like that idea quite a lot. Not everybody is willing to engage it. Okay. There are some folks who are willing to get out on a limb, and there are some folks who are a little more politic and a little more careful. So without going into who is who or who plays which role, we probably need to sort that out. But it's an interesting question whether we're ever going to land on one NIT or two NITs. Because on the one hand, now we're back at the place we started, right? Which is you get what makes sense academically, you make sense with what people do in practice, and you ask yourself, where are the investments made and who's going to walk away from an investment of a certain size in this just because they might be in the middle of getting beat. Most famously, and then we'll start to wrap up, but most famously back in the 80s, calcium channel blockers first came out. One of the realizations that emerged with the first generation of calcium channel blockers was that because they indiscriminately blocked calcium channel, that there was a phenomenon called coronary steal. You would give the drug to a patient with coronary artery disease, but if the arteries and coronary were partly occluded and the periphery were non-occluded, the periphery would open wider than coronary. You get exactly the opposite of what you wanted. You get blood stolen out of the coronary artery system. Of the first generation calcium channel blockers, the one most associated with that was nifedipine. Nifedipine was marketed by Pfizer. Pfizer spent a tremendous amount of time and money educating the public on what coronary steal was, the medical public. So when you went back and asked the medical public which calcium channel blocker has the best effect on coronary steal, they all said, well, nifedipine, because why would Pfizer be educating us about this if it were a competitive disadvantage to them? So that kind of dynamic says to me, it might be harder to get the people who finish second and third in the what's the best NIT battle to say, well, bronze medal's good enough, thanks.
I suspect that it's a bit like a lot of these races. First wins a big prize, and for the first NIT that's an endpoint in a registrational trial, that's going to be a big win for whatever that NIT is. And in some ways, we've just got to make a decision, because the longer we spend arguing over 0.01 of an OROC or 2 points of sensitivity or specificity, then the longer it is until Donna gets her wish to be beyond the biopsy.
So, yeah, and I agree with you. So let me just give you a hypothesis, though, which is that the best, if you will, utility test will be the one that will win, by which I mean solid PPV, solid NPV, not particularly tied to how the drug works. So what will ultimately damage MRI-PDFF is that it doesn't indicate what's going on with every different kind of drug based on exactly what it is the drug acts on. MRE might be better. We don't know that yet. It's not as researched. So the best utility player, the one that can solve, if you graded a test based on all the different things it has to do, PPV, NPV, and then different kinds of modes of action or different natures of points of challenge in the liver, anything adequately funded that gets all B pluses should win. I'm not sure we have that yet, but okay, go ahead.
What we're going to need in the studies is to show association with the clinical endpoints. And I think all in inverted commas, clinical endpoints are associated with fibrosis. So I think it'll be a fibrosis NIT that's going to do it. It would be a mistake, in my view, to take the least applicable fibrosis NIT like MRE into that arena, because that would be a bad move from a market perspective afterwards, because you want something that people are going to be able to use readily and quickly in practice. When the drug's launched, a blood-based test would be better, but an ultrasound elastography test would probably be acceptable too. But I think an MR-based measure it's good in phase 2. I think for showing good confidence of drug effect to take into phase 3, but for registration and applicability purposes for clinical use, I would not want that personally.
After we hang up, I'm going to give you a hypothesis of one test I think might be well positioned and why, but I don't want to go up on tape with that. So let's just start to wrap this up. So Ian, thanks. You are the second person I brought on the podcast, Louise being the first, of whom I was not aware before we launched this program. So having the two of you here together is, maybe it's because you're in the UK and I'm in the US and I didn't know a lot about life in the UK, although I knew enough to know to invite Quentin. But the truth is, I think the perspective you've brought is invaluable. Extroverts, by nature, when they don't know how to think about something, ask, well, who do I know who thinks about this in an interesting way, and what would they say? And there are questions on which I find myself saying, gee, what would Ian say about this? Which for me is candidly about as high a compliment as I pay anybody. So having you's been fantastic. I look forward to working with you a lot more. I am actually envisioning a specific role for you in the year ahead, which I'll come back to after we turn the tape off. And thanks so much.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's a highlight of my Monday evening when it's my turn to do the podcast. So I've really enjoyed it, and it's personally been really good fun. But it's also that I've got to meet people that I wouldn't otherwise have met. And despite being in the UK, I've never actually met Louise before I did the podcast, and that's been terrific.
So this is my closing note. The first time I talked with you about the podcast, your comment was, and you hadn't been on yet, that you really enjoyed hearing these global people, the KOLs, talk, because unless you could somehow footstop Quentin Anstey at a meeting, you never got to hear what the global KOLs thought. I didn't mention that on air the first time you went on with Quentin, but trust me, it was stuck right behind my brain the entire podcast.
We hope you've enjoyed this recording. If you have any questions or comments about the content of this conversation or the entire episode, please send an email to questions@surfingnash.com. We'll be back next Wednesday, August 4th, when Jeff Lazarus and Jörn Schattenberg join us to discuss their article comparing comprehensive care models to look for general rules we should apply to the treatment and management of NAFLD patients. It's a fantastic article and a great conversation. I hope you'll join us then. Until then, stay safe, surf on, see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.